Thank you, Tinashe, for joining us today and agreeing to share your work with us. Uh, Tinashe Takuva is a History Access postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Historical Studies. His broad research interests are social, environmental, and qualitative economic history, with a particular attention to histories of African peasantry. Currently, he is researching on indigenous and cultural methods of interpreting weather and climate. Tinashe's today's talk is titled The Hunger Games, Politics and Drought in Post-Colonial Zimbabwe, 1980 to 1992. Tinashe, please, the floor is yours. I will just switch off my video just in case you can't trust UCT's internet, so just to facilitate conversation. Thanks.
Hey, thank you so much, Anandarup, for such a kind introduction. Thanks to everyone for coming. So as Anandarup said, my talk today is titled The Hunger Games, Politics and Drought in Post-Colonial Zimbabwe from 1980 to 1992. Maybe as a way of introduction, the droughts of post-colonial Africa generally and Zimbabwe specifically must be understood within the context of the politics of the day and the crisis of expectation that characterized the immediate post-independence period. During this period, the general populace, dominated by peasant farmers, expected rapid changes in land distribution that would boost their productive capacity and also reduce their vulnerability to drought. Unlike the colonial state, which had made the peasants more vulnerable to droughts by forcing them into overcrowded and less fertile land and simply recruited them for labor in exchange for food during drought, the post-independent state was expected to reduce their vulnerability and do more to mitigate the effects of drought. The peasants confidently expected rescue by the state from their position of agrarian precarity. Yet, as this paper or presentation shows, their hopes were doomed to disillusionment. Using oral interviews, newspapers, parliamentary debates, and secondary literature, this article explores the relationship between politics and drought in post-independent Zimbabwe. It demonstrates that the post-colonial droughts between 1980 and 1992 were characterized by failure at government level. The ruling party exhibited a neo-patrimonialism stance, and where loyalty could not be bought, the state chose to force starvation on drought victims. And during this period, two major unconnected incidences or events shaped or provided a context within which the majority of the people experienced drought. The first is the Gukurahundi genocide, which occurred in the southern parts of Zimbabwe, the Matabeleland provinces and parts of the Midland province between 1982 and 1987. And another incident is the policy framework called Economic Structural Adjustment Program, which was implemented between 1991 and 1995. And it caused hardships, economic hardships in the short term, which provided the context within which the 1992 drought occurred and was experienced. Perhaps a brief explanation on the Gukurahundi genocide. The politics of transition from white minority rule to black majority rule was characterized by disputes and differences largely between the two nationalist political parties. One, the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, and the second, the Patriotic Front, Zimbabwe African People's Union, PF-ZAPU. The disputes extended to the military wings of these two political parties. Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, which was a military wing for ZANU, and Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, ZIPRA, which was a military wing for ZAPU. And these two were involved in the integration and formation of a national army, since this was immediately after independence. The disputes led to clashes in military camps between ZANLA and ZIPRA soldiers, and those clashes, together with the dissident problem, became a justification for the ZANU-led government to unleash a genocide named Gukurahundi. The ZANU government referred to some of the ex-guerrilla soldiers who deserted or were expelled from the army and decided to take up arms against the state as dissidents. Jocelyn Alexander reviews that these insurgent soldiers or ex-soldiers decided to take up arms because of their distrust of the newly formed army, as well as the repression by that army towards them. Alexander further notes that these soldiers had no support from PF ZAPU as claimed by the government. They only maintained their loyalty to ZAPU since they had fought the liberation war in the ZIPRA military wing. Yet the government blamed the activities of these ex-soldiers on both the ZAPU political leadership as well as the party's support base in the Matabeleland and Midlands provinces, using it as a scapegoat for executing a genocide. Alexander suggests that the total number of these insurgent soldiers was not more than 400, yet the genocide claimed around 20,000 lives. Kukurahundi was used, the word Kukurahundi was used to refer to the process of searching and dealing with dissidents, yet in fact it meant the execution of the genocide. The process of killing and torturing the Ndebele-speaking people in Matabeleland and parts of Midlands regions for their support of PF ZAPU. The breakdown of the word Kukurahundi, the Hundi part is Shona word for chaff produced after traditional food processing or the plant stalks that remain in the fields after harvesting. And Gukura or Kukura means to wipe away. Traditionally, Kukurahundi was a natural environmental way of cleansing the land when the new farmers or when the new farming season is approaching. In the context of the genocide, the government viewed its targeted people as chaff and projected itself as the rains that wash away the chaff, thereby indicating its intention to control the people and consolidate power. The use of the term genocide for Kukurahundi atrocities in this article follows historian Tembani Dube's observation that scholars have often used the terms civil war or crisis in reference to this genocide. And in 2010, an organization called Genocide Watch labeled the killings during this period as genocidal. This is the context that shaped people's experiences or people's drought experiences in Matabeleland provinces and parts of the Midlands province between 1982 and 1987. And as the drought became more pronounced in early 1983, statements made by government officials regarding the situation in the region, that is the Matabeleland provinces and parts of the Midlands province, set the tone of what was to be experienced. For instance, the then security minister, who is now the country's president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, issued a statement on the 4th of April 1983 saying, and I quote, "Blessed are those who follow the path of the government laws, for their days on earth will be increased. But woe unto those who choose a path of collaboration with the dissidents, for we will shorten their stay on earth," close quote. To enforce this, the army took over the regional depot of National Foods Company, a grain marketing board affiliated food processing company, and ensured that maize meal was not distributed in stores. In cases where stores had maize meal, it was only for a few hours. And this shows a purposeful marginalization of specific groups and clearly denying them access to food during this most difficult period. So already there's a raging drought between 1982 and 1984 and another in 1986 and 1987. And the government of the day is actually carrying out a genocide, is killing, is torturing people in a certain region in this southern region. And in that process, it is using the drought as a political tool or as a tool to actually execute the genocide. So during the drought experiences, the people experienced drought during this period in a very difficult situation or in a very difficult environment. But during this time, in 1982, the government actually, the Grain Marketing Board, a government parastatal, actually had over 2.7 million metric tons of maize in its possession at a time when the country required an estimated 1 million metric tons. So in terms of availability, food was there, but in terms of accessibility, there was purposeful marginalization of specific groups. There was purposeful denial of certain groups of their access to food. And in support of this forced starvation in the region, the then Prime Minister of the country, Robert Mugabe, while addressing a political rally in a district called Jombe in the Midlands province on the 9th of April, 1983, declared that where men and women provide food for dissidents, we will get there and we eradicate them. And this shows the intention by the government of the day to actually kill and torture people, to deny certain people access to food. In 1984, a food embargo was put in place in Matabeleland South Province at the peak of the 1982 to 84 drought. And this embargo ensured that, coupled with a curfew where people could only move from the morning up to 6 p.m., people would not be allowed to move around after 6 p.m. And there was denial of access to NGOs, non-governmental organizations who would have wanted to supply food in the region. They were denied access to the region through this food embargo, and people were clearly denied access to food. And there was no movement of food in the region. Stores were closed. Stores were also closed. And this was integral to the forced starvation by the state. And to show how deliberate this was, one of the leaders of the Gukurahundi genocide was quoted bragging at a meeting in Gwanda, a district in Matabeleland South, saying, "You are going to eat eggs." This is a direct quote. "You are going to eat eggs, and after eggs, hens meaning chickens, and after hens, goats, after goats, cattle. Then you shall eat cats, dogs, and donkeys. Then you are going to eat your children. After that, you shall eat your wives. Then the men will remain. And because dissidents have guns, they will kill the men, and only dissidents will remain. That's when we will find the dissidents," close quote. So this shows the direct intention to use food as a tool during this difficult time. And indeed, food was used as a tool in the during the process, and was at a time when people were experiencing drought. And in a shocking state of despotic environmentalism, there were incidences when people who decide to forage, people who decide to look for food, maybe in the forest through gathering, be it wild fruits, roots, and certain traditional drought coping mechanisms, were actually stopped from doing that and punished. People who were caught doing that were actually punished, severely tortured by the soldiers. And the Catholic Commission Justice and Peace Report states that about civilians fell victim to state-induced hunger. In certain cases, the state paraded what historian Tembantube calls Yepi villages, where they could go to a certain village and distribute food. But oral interviews have shown that beneficiaries of that paraded drought relief were at times followed up during the night and disposed of the maize distributed during the day. So this was only a parade to show that, to try to show the world that there was access to food in the region, but in actual fact, there were follow-ups and people were actually dispossessed of the food that would have been distributed during the day. And this worsened hunger in the area. Beyond that, there were also detention camps that were established, and the detention camps were from the government's mouth. It was an idea of trying to isolate dissidents, so they could put ZAPU officials, the elderly children in those detention camps, and justifying that we are trying to isolate dissidents when they're also trying to ensure that people don't support dissidents. But the effect of the detention camps was that they prevented ordinary people from working in their fields. The state deliberately stopped people from working in their fields as a way of forcing them to starve. The army occasionally even broke down fences and allowed cattle to graze the few crops that might have survived drought. And beyond that, even people who were tortured whilst working in their fields on accusations that they were supporting dissidents. Some of the people who resisted to go into detention camps were killed in the fields, resulting in the establishment of what they call sacred fields, which exist even to date. And these sacred fields were simply certain areas of the field where someone was killed for resisting to go into the detention camp whilst working in their field, and people would then respect that area and cover it or avoid cultivating that area, thereby also contributing or affecting the total land area that is cultivated and worsening the food insecurity situation in the region. As a result, I demonstrate that for the Mugabe government, drought between 1980 and 87 became a useful political tool to extend hegemony in the Matabeleland and Midlands region. But what is happening in other provinces during the same time? The government was extending free issues of grain in response to drought, but it was still using those to consolidate power through patronage. Drought relief was disbursed on political party lines more than through government structures. It was very common for one to be asked to recite a ZANU political party slogan praising the party leader, Robert Mugabe, to qualify for drought relief. So during this period, the first decade of independence, the government, through the leading political party, the ruling party, actually used drought as a way of consolidating political power. But that's up to 1987. 5 years later, another drought affected the country. And this drought hit the country at a time the government was implementing an IMF suggested or an IMF drafted structural adjustment program, which was called ESAP, Economic Structural Adjustment Program. So this policy, a liberalization policy, caused hardships in the short term. There were economic hardships that were caused by retrenchments, economic hardships that were caused by the general increase in prices of commodities on the market. And this created what I call a drought ESAP nexus, whereby drought, the 1992 drought, which is actually considered the worst drought in 20th century Zimbabwe, came at a time ESAP was being implemented, thereby affecting the implementation of the policy. And the policy, or the immediate negative impacts of the policy, also affected people's coping mechanisms because of the hardships that it induced. But what characterized the state's response to drought during this period, I demonstrate that there was a lot of poor planning that manifested in grain import, storage, and distribution during the time. Poor planning actually dates to 1991, before the drought itself, when ESAP was just started being implemented. In April 1991, the president of the Commercial Farmers Union, A.F. Thompson, alerted the nation that there was a serious crisis and maize production was drastically reduced. He warned that there were serious indications that Zimbabweans might be forced to import maize the following year, a situation that would be unacceptable to a country which is considered to be the grainer of the region. The fall in maize production was a direct result of the structural adjustments, which changed the lavish pricing of the Grain Marketing Board, the parastatal responsible for buying agricultural commodities. Thompson, the CFU president, lamented that there was no incentive to grow maize. But the government, through the GMB, dismissed these reports of grain production crisis, and the then chairperson of the GMB, Sifas Msiba, denied reports of grain shortage and assured the nation that the GMB had 200,000 tons of maize in reserve, and delivery of maize to the board would traditionally increase in August. But this was at a time the nation required an estimated 1 million tons of maize per year. So already before the drought occurred, there were signs of poor planning. There were signs of no proactive policies being implemented to curb the effect of drought. And during the drought itself, poor planning also manifested in different ways. One of the ways was what certain members of parliament called the drought of ministries, in terms of lack of certain ministers or ministries to plan accordingly. Despite the existence of a transport and logistics subcommittee under the National Drought Relief Committee, logistical challenges marred the coordination of drought relief. At some point, it was reported that it took more than 2 months to transport maize that was purchased from South Africa. This led one parliamentarian, Stephen Vuma, to declare that we must be realistic here, that the drought we are talking about is not the drought because of rains. It is the failure of administration because of government for those ministries concerned. It is not true that it is a drought we are talking about today, but it is the drought of the ministries concerned that have failed to see, that have lied before the drought, that there was enough foodstuff in stock. And this generally shows the failure of government to plan. The table here shows the distribution of drought relief between January 1992 and November. And basically it shows how demand kept on increasing as the year progressed and supply reduced, which is shown at the extreme right, where ration was initially 10 kgs per person in January and ended up being 5 kgs per person per month by November. But how did peasants experience this waste drought? Cattle being central to their livelihoods, obviously peasants could not just hold their hands watching helplessly as their precious commodity was being wiped away by drought. They always tried to find ways, exercising a peasant option, to ensure that they survive as well as their livestock. In a district called Mberengwa in the Midlands province, some villagers took their cattle to as far as Filabusi, an area in Matabeleland South, and grazed their cattle along Insiza and Mzingwane rivers, which had pockets of water and limited pastures around. Such a drought coping mechanism required endurance and risk, as villagers themselves affected by drought and not having adequate food would travel long distances with cattle looking for pastures. On arrival in areas of better pastures, the villagers often left cattle there, risking stock theft, and returned home only to go and look for their cattle after a week or so. Leaving the cattle for a week was to avoid straining them walking a long distance to and from Delhi, which would defeat the whole idea of better pastures. In Gwanda, a district in Matabeleland South, some communal farmers relied on nearby commercial farms where they would rent pastures. One of my interviewees actually recalls that in the 1992 drought, their livestock survived by grazing on a nearby farm where they later on paid one cow as a grazing fee for the whole year. But this actually shows how these peasants did not have enough land. Yet, upon independence, they expected a redress of colonial policies. They expected that they could actually be given more land and become less vulnerable to drought. So this whole scenario actually raised a land question, particularly in the livestock-dominated southern region of the country. One parliamentarian from Matabeleland North Province raised the land question as a long-term solution to drought in parliament. And he said, and I quote, "We're going to acquire more land since the bill is passed through, and the bill being referred to was a land bill. We shall expect government to listen to us carefully. We shall expect one family in Matabeleland to be given not less than 300 hectares so that the people are not going to starve again, so that our cattle are not going to starve to death again. But once we propose this to government, we may be told that it is too much land. We were born in the area. We know how many cattle are necessary for one family to survive. Therefore, anything less than 300 hectares for one family will not enable this family to survive with those cattle. If government can listen and give our people what we demand, definitely our people are not going to die the next time." And this basically shows how the land question became very key during the 1992 drought. In conclusion, in this article, we demonstrate that politics trumped policy in mitigating drought during this early period of independence. And beyond that period, this has actually been the norm in Zimbabwe to date, where politics actually affects how people cope with drought, or how the government responds to drought in a very negative way. As I've shown in this presentation, between 1980 and 1987, the Mugabe government successfully used drought as a power retention tool. And in the 1992 drought, cases of poor planning, corruption, nepotism, profiteering affected the coordination of drought response. But during this whole process, peasants exercised the peasant option. With this, I've come to the end of my presentation. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tinashe. The floor is open. Questions, comments, you know the drill. You can put your hand up using the hand tool, or just you can switch on your video, or if you can just ask a question. If you don't want to switch on the video, that's also fine. The floor is open. Questions and comments for Tinashe. Brian, please, Brian, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tinashe, for the very interesting conversation. The issue on the role of politics and food and hunger and drought is very essential, more importantly, over the past 2-3 decades in Southern Africa. But I have a quick question. With your reference to the Gukurahundi incidences and how that propelled a lot of drought, the state of drought within that region. I'm curious, was the impact of drought homogeneous across the country? And can you say there are certain areas that did not experience drought in the same way as other areas did? And then locate that in the conversation of how the government then comes in and uses food parcels to distribute and maintain wealth, how that also perpetuated on one end a cycle of dependency and on the other end a cycle of privilege to those who are benefiting from the state assistant aid.
Tinashe, so
Yes.
there are two hands after Brian's question. So what we can do is we can take all the three questions together and you respond, or do you want to respond to Brian separately? I mean, whatever you feel comfortable with.
Okay, that's fine. Maybe I can quickly respond to Brian before I go to the next questions.
Okay, fine.
Thanks, Brian, for your question. Yes, of course, drought in terms of lack of rain, reduced harvest was not uniform across the country. For instance, in the Eastern Highlands province or in the Eastern Highlands region, there were better harvests there. But when it comes to now the government's response, this is where you find in the southern region, particularly Matabeleland provinces and Midlands province, where actually the impact of drought was worse. The government actually decided to then use food as a political tool because the government had food in its silos. The government had maize, grain in silos, and it was the best to provide food relief during this difficult time. But it then used those food parcels as a political tool. I don't know if I've clearly answered you.
Thanks, Tinashe. So, Shamil, please, do you want to just maybe ask your question, or do you want me to read it out?
Sorry, it was very noisy.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yeah, it's extremely, there's some vacuuming going on. So,
okay.
Can you just read it for me, please?
Okay, sure. Okay.
I'm running away from the noise.
Not a problem. Sorry, Shamil's question, Tinashe, is please tell us about the range of media, their warnings or not, about the coming drought and during the two periods. Could you hear that, Tinashe?
Yes, clearly.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Prof. Shamil, for the question. Yes, in terms of media warnings, during the period that I cover, you actually have you have more of media coverage of the incidences than prior warning on coming droughts. Few incidences of warnings of the coming droughts, especially in 1992, is what I mentioned, an exchange between officials of certain organizations like the Commercial Farmers Union, the Grain Marketing Board. These exchanges were actually through media, and they actually provided a warning that a disaster is coming. So much of what is in the media is actually coverage of drought incidents more than warnings. I don't know if I've clearly answered that.
Okay, no, thanks. Thanks.
Okay, great. There are quite a few questions. Aisha, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Tinashe, for your presentation. Maybe this is just a follow-up on Brian's question. Were there disparities between the urban areas and the rural areas insofar as the drought was concerned? From a presentation, I noticed that you mentioned about peasant reaction to this drought and drought mitigation strategies by these peasants. But how was the situation in the urban centers? How did they survive?
Thanks, Aisha, for the question. Yes, I mainly focus on the rural population, but equally important is the urban population, how they survived or what were their experiences. Maybe in brief, I can just say, particularly for the 1992 drought, the coverage mainly by the media, by newspapers, by or even in parliamentary debates, shows that the urban populace was actually more concerned by the changes from that sort of socialist experiment of the first decade, where there was free healthcare or heavily subsidized healthcare and education. And now during the drought, beyond retrenchment, they are the ones who are most affected by retrenchments, which were induced by structural adjustments. And they are actually also facing challenges in terms of high school fees, for instance, high prices of healthcare. So their major complaints were around issues to do with those. If government could assist in maybe postponing this cutting of luxuries such as state subsidized primary education, state subsidized healthcare. Those are the major complaints of the urbanites. But also there were disparities even in terms of government response. Much of government drought relief programs were in the rural more than in the urban. Much of the rations were in the rural more than in the urban. And my explanation of this is actually this extension of or this neo-patrimonialism stance that the government projected, whereby they really wanted to control the rural population through these food parcels. Remember, this is the same government which has been, which has had a strong rural support base during the war, during the liberation war in the 70s. So they were actually more concerned about that population, that rural population, and that's where most of the drought relief programs took place.
Thank you, Tinashe. Jabulani?
Right, Tinashe, thank you very much for this insightful paper and presentation. I just have one or two questions. I wanted to ask maybe in terms of the traditional leaders across different provinces in Zimbabwe. You know, did the state use traditional leaders such as chiefs in strengthening their political mileage? And if yes, to what extent was this, and how was it important in shaping the drought politics nexus? And also, I wanted to know, especially during the Gukura Wundi, how did the people respond? Were they passive? Were they silent? And were there any alternative, you know, livestock and agrarian practices that they used to thwart the hunger that they were experiencing? Thank you.
Thanks, Jabulani. In terms of traditional leadership, how the state incorporated traditional leadership in its drought response. Yes, as I said in the presentation, you actually have food relief being dispersed, particularly during the first decade of independence, being distributed more on party lines than through government structures. So these party lines involved the use of chiefs, headmen, the use of chiefs and headmen up to village level. The connection of the political party up to village level was through political party structures, and these political party structures involved both members of the political party within the area as well as the traditional leadership within the area. So yes, the traditional leadership was incorporated in this politics of patronage. And in terms of your other question, during the genocide, were people passive? Were peasants passive? No, they were not really passive. The repression was that much. Yes, the state killed, the state tortured, the state machinery was not something that they could face on, but they actually exercised the peasant option. In as much as they were punished for foraging, it doesn't mean they stopped. So they always exercised those type of options. But I demonstrate that the state machinery was excessive. For instance, my oral research shows that people actually had their cattle, their livestock killed during this period as a way of neutralizing them, as a way of forcing starvation on them. And many of them to date, they say they haven't recovered the livestock that was killed by the state, by the soldiers during that time. So in as much as they were not passive, the state power was excessive. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tinashe. Teve, and after that, Brian again has another question, or is that an old hand, Brian?
It's a new one.
Okay, great. So after Teve, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Tinashe, for your presentation. In your conclusion, you said that food has been used by the state to advance its political interests, and is the situation up to now. And my question is related to other players who are also involved in food distribution to the citizens. And in this case, I may point to NGOs. And at the present, there are contestations between the state and NGOs with regard to food aid, where the state accuses NGOs of giving food aid to the citizens with political messages that seek to resist the state dominance on the citizens. And on the other hand, the NGOs argue that the state also uses food aid to advance its political interests. So my question is that in the period that your main period of focus, what was the situation like in terms of food distribution? Were there other players which were involved, and were there accusations and counter accusations in terms of using food as a political tool, or it was just a monopoly of the state, meaning food distribution was just a state monopoly? Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Thanks, Teve, for the question. So During Gukurahundi, the first decade, there was actually a time when there was a food embargo. Donors were actually shunned from accessing certain areas. And to answer you, yes, donors were not really accused of maybe supporting the opposition or what, but they were totally shunned, which is closely related to current events, but I'll get there. During the 1992 drought, non-governmental organizations actually played a role to a point where the government actually, after the drought, extended a message to non-governmental organizations, recognized, acknowledged the role that was played by non-governmental organizations such as Christian Care, well, I'm not sure for what vision, but Christian Care and Care were very common in so many districts during the period. And there was not much talk about politics during the period or supporting certain political actors through non-governmental organizations. Although there was the emergence of this political party, Zimbabwe United Movement, which was there during the time, but there was no much talk of NGOs being in support of opposition through their food relief programs. But perhaps, like I said in the conclusion, that this issue of politics dominating drought relief, or politics affecting the coordination of drought relief to date, in terms of these non-governmental organizations, the main issue between the government and these NGOs is that the government of the day, the ruling party, wants to be the sole provider in terms of drought relief, since they use it as a political tool. So they don't want a challenge. Anyone who seems to challenge, who seems to neutralize them, becomes an opponent. That's why they're so much concerned about any other organization that distributes food or food relief during droughts. They always try to attack them. They always try to blame them. They are Western sponsored, and all sorts of accusations, because it neutralizes the government's role, or the ruling party's role, where it politicizes drought relief, or it politicizes food during drought relief. So they're always concerned about any other player who come to neutralize their position.
Thank you, Tinashe. Brian, do you mind if I ask Nompilo to go first? Then you can come with your second question, if that's okay. Okay, great. Nompilo?
Thank you, Anandaroop. Hello, everyone from the department. It's been a while. Tinashe, I'm not really sure if I'm asking a question. I'm really just sharing my interesting observations. I know your research goes up to the 1992 period, but I do wonder if you will continue researching in this thread, because I mean, we do know that we still have a history of droughts, and we still have a government that deliberately prefers to rather provide people with maize during drought, swoop in as a hero with maize, as opposed to actually pre-planning for droughts and actually solving. The drought issue has never been solved, right? Up to 2018, 2019, there was drought. And again, there was food relief. But I was just wondering what your observations are now that whilst we're in the same, and more, I've moved historically along into the 2000s, where despite the change in rulership, even though the party is still the same, what the historical precedence is now, because we are back under the 2017 dispensation, and again, there's a focus on command agriculture, right? This is one of the things the government prioritized and promised the people, and this is how Mnangagwa got into power in 2017, that he promised that he would deal with the agricultural issue. And so he does, and in his command agriculture, he gives people 50 kgs of planting maize seed every year, along with compound D and E fertilizer for farming purposes. And he usually does this in the geographical regions 2 and 3, where generally the land is better. I'm trying to figure out if there's a bit of exclusionary politics even in agriculture and in farming, because we know that the Matabele lands, which you referred to earlier, are in the most droughtest prone regions of Zim, like they're in regions 4 and 5, where it barely rains like 500 milliliters of like water a year. So I'm wondering if we can still see agriculture and the history that there's still a political tool around it, because if you keep making command agriculture about giving people seeds and fertilizer, and yet you're doing it for people that are drought prone, they are actually drought prone. Plants don't grow well, the maize doesn't grow well, people always starve, and it's actually better for them to take care of cattle and to do ranching. If there's a political aspect to that as well, it's just a lack of planning. I'm trying to figure out how command agriculture as we know it today is still very much about planting maize, and yet Matabele land, which is at least over 40% of the land space, is in a drought zone, and it's just better suited to cattle ranching and livestock, and why the government doesn't seem to address that.
Thanks, Nompilo. Lovely having you back and to hear your voice. Yes, Tinashe.
Thank you so much, Nompilo, for those interesting ideas. And actually, the issue that you are raising is a history. It's complex and very historical. It's not even a post-2017 scenario. I'm sure Brian, who is raising a hand, must have a coming article on that, where you actually have not only in post-2017 in the command agriculture system, but even prior to that, you actually have a situation whereby the government goes through what they call presidential agricultural input schemes. They go and donate agricultural inputs, maize, fertilizers, and other inputs to areas which are drought-stricken, to areas where they know fully well that agriculture doesn't do well. Maybe small grains do better, but they keep on distributing maize. And I see a lot of politics in this. The end result is that maize won't do well, and the people in those regions will require state assistance when there's drought, or when at the end of the season, and the state will then project itself as the Messiah. But who is really the problem here? So yes, I found those deliberations very, 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 very interesting. Even the command agriculture that you then pointed out to post-2017, the government supplies inputs even in areas that are, well, in some areas they've been talks of command livestock, all this command economics. The implementation of the projects, sometimes they're highly politicized as well. Not everyone gets the inputs, as well as the issue of distributing the inputs, or even not, to drought-stricken areas where they know fully well that certain crops don't do well. Eventually, they will come in as the savior. They will come in as the ones who are helping, yet they are really part of the problem. And yes, I may think about extending this research to the 2000s, from the fast-track land reform to present times, and capture all these dynamics. Thank you so much, Nompilo, for that.
Thank you, Tinashe. Aisha has a comment. Maybe you can come back to that after Brian's question. Brian, please go ahead.
Oh, okay, thank you very much. I've been following the conversation, Tinashe, very interesting. Quickly though, you have scholars such as Eiliff and Anderson who juxtapose a drought versus a famine, arguing that the drought is natural, then the famine is the one that is man-made or man-induced. Following from the element of politics and how you are stringing in the despotic ZANU-PF regime in exacerbating the hunger and famine and drought in Zimbabwe, would you not better suit it in describing what was occurring under a study period and perhaps even in the longer duration thereafter as a famine more than a drought? And then the other part, when you then also speak of the peasant options and the coming in of the whole socialist experiment, to what extent are we also going to highlight the drought as a genuine concern vis-a-vis what you also mentioned as being a crisis of expectation in line with the idea that a socialist experiment is coming on and now people expect more land and that land doesn't come about? It's not a case of perhaps, do we not have any incidences where, yes, they may have just been hunger, but it was not as acute as has now been put across, but because someone maybe expected 10 hectares and they only got 2, it does create that crisis. Have you come across such conversations where there's that also crisis of that expectation within the narratives that then exacerbates the idea and the extent of the hunger and the famine? And then lastly, then I'll be quiet for the whole session here after, I'm sure, which integrates some of your new work that I heard you are doing. What type of drought was it? Was it meteorological? Was it a food drought, environmental? What type of droughts are you encompassing? Because I also feel that each one of them would have a different impact on society and how different government policies respond and react to that.
Thank you, Brian. And of course, please, if you have more questions, feel free to ask them. I mean, we are here for the discussion, and thank you for your participation. Okay, why don't we take Sean's question as well, because we are a little running close to our So
yes, Ananda, I think we can give Sean a chance to ask.
Excellent. So we'll also get Sean on board. Yeah.
Hi, Tinashe. Thanks for a fascinating presentation. A different question. I've been privileged to supervise several Zimbabwean historians over several years, but and you spoke a lot about your oral history interviews, and I'm just curious about your experience of, my question's about sort of conditions of field work. Where and when did you do the interviews? And did, I've had these conversations with several other students about, were you able to do, for example, interviews in Zimbabwe? Did people feel free to express, their critical views about whether it's the Kuruhundi or particular parts of state policy? I mean, what's your experience of the conditions of field work? Thanks.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean. Sorry, I'll start with Sean. I'll go to Brian. My experience with fieldwork. So I did my interviews in a district called Mberengwa in the Midlands. Then also in a district called Gwanda. But in a district called Gwanda, I engaged a research assistant who comes from the area. So that helped me a lot because I'm sort of more an outsider. I also do not speak the language. So I engaged a research assistant who also had written something on the area, on that particular area. So that helped me in terms of getting much information about Kuruhundi through oral interviews. But in terms of where I then did my own interviews, there was a lot of comfort. Here and there, you realize people are tense. You maybe go back to the same person for the second and third time. Sometimes they relax a bit. Sometimes you realize they remain tense, especially when you talk much about state policy. So yes, it wasn't rosy, but I think I consider it successful. I consider the experience successful. I don't know if I have clearly answered you. Then Brian, you raised I think a lot of questions. First one was on hunger versus famine. Yes, actually have the issue of John Iliffe that you mentioned earlier. Iliffe actually focused on famine more because of what he says in the introduction of his book, that he was more concerned about population trends. So you realize that the debates on famine and hunger, when it comes to drought, or before we even come to drought, famine is caused by a lot of things, natural disasters, not only drought, natural disasters beyond drought, including floods and so forth. Then also, it's not always famine. It can be hunger that then degenerates into famine. An interesting point is where different scholars actually credit the Zimbabwean government during the 1992 drought that besides the whole chaos, besides whatever happened, they credit it for ensuring that the worst drought in the 20th century did not degenerate into a great famine. So yes, the back and forth or the debates around famine and hunger suggest that most of the droughts in 20th century Zimbabwe mainly caused hunger and not famine. I have a number of cases where droughts degenerated into famine, two of them being the 1947 drought, where there were cases of famine in different areas of the country, and also in some parts of the country during 1992. But during Gukuraundi, forced starvation during periods of drought always manifested in different things, hunger, and in worst case scenarios, famine. But it's difficult to qualify that or even to attribute it only to drought, because there was also the genocide being carried out. And that connects us. I think Ananda is about to tell me that it's time up.
No, Tinashe, sorry. The time is also up, unfortunately, but I just wanted to, because Nompilo has a quick question. So do you mind if she asks the question quickly, and you can probably, if there is enough time, just respond to everything with one final concluding statement. Yes. Nompilo, please go ahead and be brief. I'm sorry, but...
I will be brief. I just wonder, in your future work, that you should consider seriously dedicating time towards the gender conversation. If you're speaking about drought, its impact across gender, and more specifically land, and just the history of just how it impacts women's land inheritance hasn't been a thing in rural areas where you are focused, or how chiefs will kind of apportion portions to land for people. And basically how, if you're talking about drought, politics and history, how gender also comes into that equation. So I was just mentioning it because I think it's a missing component if you're talking about agriculture, considering that most of them are actually the peasant farmers.
Thanks, Nompilo.
Very, very interesting, Nompilo. Well, I will come to that. I wanted to maybe comment on the last point raised by Brian about different types of droughts. Yes, in most cases of these droughts that I'm actually focusing on, or droughts in general, the different types actually they actually come as a set. For instance, a meteorological drought will actually manifest into a hydrological and agricultural drought, then lastly socio-economic drought. So when I talk of these droughts, when I talk of how the state ended up and the peasants ended up responding and reacting, it would have reached the socio-economic drought level or position. So it starts as a meteorological drought where we're talking about the rains only. Then the hydrological and agricultural, where rivers become empty, where agricultural production is affected. Then when that affects supply and demand, it then comes to the socio-economic drought. And Nombilo, thank you so much for that issue of gender, where you actually have a lot of women being a lot of women actually working in the fields, a lot of women engaging in agriculture, but rarely owning the means of production, and customary laws actually denying them access to land. The chiefs, when they're distributing land, usually they consider men as sort of the father of the house and all, and women are sidelined. So I think, like you mentioned, something that I need to seriously consider in my future studies in this area is about drought, agriculture, and gender. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Tinashe. I don't know if it's possible for you to turn on your video for a second. I just wanted to see your face once. And thank you for sharing your work. And thank you everyone for participating and contributing to a lively discussion. I had a question and comment, but I'll do it in person when we see each other, hopefully soon, because we are completely out of time. And thank you again. And we'll have the last talk of our series this semester next Wednesday. Hopefully we'll see some of you there as well. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, Tinashe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.